Hi guys, it's Crystal. I hope you guys are all doing well today and that you've had a good week. Happy almost Father's Day to all those fathers out there or father figures or anybody who fills that role in a child's life. I hope you guys have a great day tomorrow. If you guys are new to this channel, like I said, my name is Crystal and I do Canadian true crime or true crime with a Canadian twist. From time to time, I do talk about other international crimes. Today, and actually for the next couple weeks, is going to be one of those cases. We're focusing on a very infamous American case today, and probably for the next 3 weeks, guys, to be honest with you, I do assume this is going to be at least 3 parts. You guys know how long-winded I am. And I did give you hints last week. Of course, you'll see it from the title of the movie too, who we're going to be talking about, but you know that's how it's gonna go. So hopefully, if that's something that appeals to you guys will like these videos, you'll subscribe, please, you'll hit that notification bell, you'll share if you want to, and you'll leave me some comments. I always say it, but particularly about this case, I do want to know what people think about this case. There could be things that I'm missing. When I talk about international crimes, it's a little harder for me because I have specific news outlets that I trust here in Canada. In the States, I'm also looking for those news outlets. You guys know that I don't tend to focus on Wikipedia as much. I try to find like articles from the time, which in this case is harder because I'd have to try to go into archives for them. But I am using 2 books. So hopefully, if that sounds like something you guys like, you will subscribe. And if you guys are returning members, you guys already know how much I love you and how thankful I am that you guys invite me into your home. Now, this case was actually recommended to me by a subscriber last year. He asked me if I would cover it. I did say I would around July 4th, right? You guys know, American Independence Day holiday. So for today, I'm wearing my RFK for President shirt, and I try to do my makeup red, white, and blue. I think I kind of failed a little bit, so it's a good thing that you guys are farther away from me. But anyway, we got to get into it, guys, because this is going to be long, as you guys already know. Today, we're doing Ted Bundy. Today and probably for the next 2 weeks after that. I think we'll hit the July 4th if we do it this way. So most of the information, guys, I am taking is not from articles. I am taking it from The Phantom Prince, which was actually written by Liz Kendall. That's the pseudonym she's given herself here. Her real name is Liz. One of her names is Cloffer, and I do refer to it in my notes. That was an old married name of hers. She does have a different last name, but she deserves her anonymity. If anybody in this case does, it's Liz. So we will be taking a lot of material from this book. And of course, the penultimate book, Anne Rule's The Stranger Beside Me. You guys have already seen, like, you guys can clearly see where I've marked things in the book. So Ted Bundy, guys, what more can be said about Ted Bundy? Even if you know bare bones facts about this case, it is still highly fascinating, even to this day, to try to figure out exactly who or what Ted Bundy is. Everybody's going to have different opinions on this. Was he a psychopath? Was he a narcissist? Was he a sociopath? Was he just somebody that was born evil? What about the factors in his life? And I know in the true crime community, we have taken flack for trying to explain somebody's life before they started murdering. I do it because sociology, guys, you know, I studied it. That's what I majored in. So to me, it's very interesting to see how his mind worked in society. We will get into parts of that, but there are so many things in this case, guys. You know, if anybody knows the bare bones facts, this guy escaped from prison twice. He killed in multiple states. It is a very, very, very long case, so it's going to take at least 3 episodes to be able to do this. Today, we're focusing on Ted Bundy's childhood and events up till 1974 and a little bit at the start of 74. There are certain instances in here where he is comparable to Paul Bernardo. You guys are going to know because I will say it. But Ted Bundy was an interesting man. However, I do have to point out that a lot of the information sometimes can be confusing or may not make sense. This is because Ted was known for telling certain stories to certain people. Then he'd retract or he'd tell various versions of the story. He also liked to, if you guys have watched like the confession tapes or anything like that, he liked to refer to himself in third person because it was easier, or like it wasn't like he called himself Ted Bundy, but like the perpetrator would do this. It was much easier for him to describe his crimes that way so as not to fully attribute them to himself. So just a couple of pictures here, guys. This is probably, one of the more well-known pictures of Ted. There's Ted as a child. We're focusing on that today, so we'll get into it. All right, guys. So buckle up. Here we go. So Ted Bundy was actually born, you guys know, Theodore Robert Cowell, November 24th of 1946. His mother's name is Eleanor Louise Cowell, or was at that point in time, and she was 22 years old. She was unmarried. Ted was an illegitimate baby. She's been described as a good girl from a very highly religious background. However, she did put down the name, or the name has been thrown around, that Ted Bundy's father's name was a man named Lloyd Marshall. Now, Lloyd would have been about 30. He was in the Air Force, and he did have a university education. I think this is the man that Ted more than likely thought was his father. But Eleanor does refer to him as just a sailor. Those are her own words. She doesn't talk about him. She never did. So she never actually made mention of who Ted's real father was. We have no idea. He was stamped as illegitimate. They actually used to do that, guys. They would stamp it on your birth certificate that you were illegitimate. And you guys know, of course, it still happens sometimes now even, but particularly in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and way back then, it was considered highly undesirable to have a child out of wedlock. Maybe not as bad as in the 1800s, but there was still a huge stigma that your child would have to carry around the term bastard for the rest of their life. Louise didn't want that for her baby. Now, for Louise herself, her father's name was Sam Cowell, and her mother's name was also Eleanor. That's why sometimes I'll refer to her as Eleanor and sometimes Louise. She went by both names, but it was usually Louise after 1950, and we're going to get into that in a couple minutes. So she was from Philadelphia. That's where her family was from. And she did have she did have sisters. There was a large age gap between herself, I believe she was the oldest, and her younger sister. There was about 10 years between them. So her younger sister would have been about 12 when Ted was born. And her family was very, very strictly religious. Very strictly religious. So for her to have to tell her family that she was pregnant was probably very hard for her. I could imagine it was very hard for her. And her family was deeply saddened, deeply disappointed, upset about it, but they didn't react the way you would think. They didn't kick her out or anything. They did support her, I guess, in a way. Now, Sam Cowell, which would be Ted's grandpa, has been described in two different ways, because Ted himself said that he remembered his grandfather as this like loving guy. He really respected him. He remembered him with fondness. However, other family members, not Louise herself, though I do want to point it out, it wasn't Louise herself. Other family members did describe Sam as a tyrant who was prone to tantrums, fits. He was very abusive. He would abuse animals as well. And there is a school of thought out there that said that Louise could have been sexually abused by Sam and that Ted was a product of this abuse. This is just a story going around because other names have been thrown out too. I just find it kind of hard to believe that if she was such a good girl and so strictly religious, that so many other names could have been thrown out for who Ted Bundy's father really was. But regardless, that is what happened. Now, his grandmother, Eleanor, was kind of like a meek, mild little woman. And her husband, Sam, did rule her with an iron fist. He was abusive towards her for sure. So when Louise found out that she was pregnant, she did go back home and she was staying at home. She stayed there until she was about 7 months pregnant. And as with the time, because she was unmarried, she did go off to a home for unwedded pregnant people. This was the Elizabeth Lund Home for Unwedded. I'm going to get the exact name right. Sorry guys, just give me a second. The Elizabeth Lund Home for Unwed Mothers. And this was in Burlington, Vermont. So she traveled all the way to Vermont to have this child. Now, she, being so religious, abortion was never considered in her case. And she did not consider adoption either. Not the adoption you would think of. We'll get into that. So just hold on for a second. She knew she was going to have the baby, and she did, for her part, love Ted. She didn't actually want to get rid of him, but she didn't want to have that stigma on him. It wasn't so much for herself. She just didn't want him to grow up with the stigma of being illegitimate. So when she did return home, there are some reports that she was home for about 3 months before she went and got Ted and brought him home. I'm not sure how much that's true, but there are some reports that say that she did leave him in the home for unwed mothers for 3 months and then brought him back with her. Now, her parents and her concocted a plan that they would say that Ted was a late in life baby for Sam and Eleanor, that Eleanor had given birth to him in late in life. There are some reports that said they adopted him and brought him home that way. But regardless, he was raised to believe that his mother and father were Sam and Eleanor, and that Louise was merely his much older sister. So he stayed with the Cowell family, and he was close to the Cowell family. He did stay with them. He had a lot of cousins and everything else, and he was fairly close to the Cowell side of his family. And he did stay with them until he was about 4. In 1950, there were too many people, let's just say in Philadelphia, who were able to trace Ted's real parentage. Too many people in her own family knew that she was actually Ted's mother. She did not want this getting out, number 1, because of the stigma towards Ted, number 2, because it would be frowned upon in society as well. She decided too many people knew, so she was going to up and move to Tacoma, Washington. She had a lot of extended family, or I shouldn't say a lot, she had extended family that lived in Tacoma, Washington at the time, and they said that she and Ted could come and live there. So in 1950, and this would be about October 6th of 1950, Louise legally changed Ted's name from Theodore Robert Cowell to Theodore Robert Nelson. She figured that the last name was really common, so there wouldn't be so many questions about his parentage, number 1. Number 2, she figured it would be easier to make up a story about it. It would be easier to throw people off so that Ted would be believed to be legitimate. However, she was still going as his sister. She was not conceding that she was his mother. She was still pretending that she was his sister. So I don't know what she gave for this, what reason she gave for the fact that she would have been about 25 at this point in time, and with her she would have been about 26 at this point in time, and with her 4-year-old brother ended up in Tacoma, Washington, but it doesn't really matter. She decided to go to Washington State, and she chose Nelson because she felt it would spare Ted the pain of being illegitimate. And also it would just be easier in life in general for him to enroll in school with. So they moved to Tacoma, Washington a little bit later, after October 6th, probably more towards the end of the year. And Eleanor herself started going actively by Louise at this point. I don't know if she fully legally changed her name to Louise, it was her middle name, or if she just started going by that way. So Ted did have a little bit of a rough time with this move because he was so attached, according to him, to his grandfather Sam, and father Sam. He did have a hard time with it at first, but nevertheless they did settle in. So Louise got a secretary job and joined the Methodist Church. Like I said, she was still very religious, and it was at the Methodist Church that she met a man named Johnny Culpepper Bundy. The two of them only dated for a very short time because they did get married May 19th of 1951. Ted was at the wedding. still as posing as her small little brother. He still thought he was her little brother. And he was about 5 years old at this time. However, I don't know how it was done, and I don't know if it was ever done legally, but Johnny knew about his parentage. Ted didn't know, but Johnny did know. So Ted was adopted by Johnny and thus legally became, for the third time, this is his third name in 5 years, legally became Theodore Robert Bundy. And that was the last name that stuck. This was his name. Johnny was a cook. And I believe he worked at a hospital. I believe he worked at a hospital as a cook there. And Louise thought that he was just a kind man. And he seemed very shy, but he seemed very kind to Eleanor. So, of course, Louise. So, of course, they did get married. Now, Tacoma itself is on the banks of Puget Sound. I hope I'm saying it right. Is it Puget Sound? I believe that's how I was told that it was said, Puget Sound. And it's about 51 kilometers away from Seattle itself, Seattle proper. Its population is about 212,869, and that was as of 2020, guys. So it's rather large. It's probably way larger than most of the cities I talk about in Canada. It's fairly large. And it's actually the third largest city in Washington itself. Tacoma is well known for its art. We're always talking about places that are well known for their art, but it's particularly its glass art. And it's also... I do want you guys to know, however, that you have about a 1 in 117 people chance of being the victim of a violent crime. Tacoma itself has about 18 murders a year, and there do seem to be a lot of serial killers that gravitate in the Tacoma area. If you guys put it together. So we have Ted Bundy, but the Green River Killer as well. Just putting that out there. So Ted ended up with 4 half-siblings. It's very hard. We'll get into why. It's like Ted knew, but he didn't know. He didn't know for sure, but he had an inkling that Louise was his mother. So, however, he ended up with 4 other brothers and sisters, half siblings. He had 2 brothers and 2 sisters. And the youngest sibling was actually born when Ted was 15. However, he didn't seem to have any problems with these younger brothers and sisters. He was not abusive to them. And he was actually the first to volunteer to babysit them. He looked after them quite often, and he seemed to enjoy them. He was particularly close to his youngest brother. He really did love that kid as much as Ted Bundy could love anybody. He didn't have a very good relationship with Johnny. Now, a lot of people say that it's because Johnny was abusive towards Ted. You have to remember that in prior times, I would say more or less prior to the 90s, people had a different way of disciplining their children. It was learned behavior. I'm not saying it was right. I don't believe in corporal punishment. It's not good. But that's how they chose to discipline their kids, the majority of people back then. So Johnny Culpepper Bundy would discipline Ted with a belt if Ted was acting out. However, I want you guys to know it was actually Louise that ruled that part of the house, and Johnny just did what he told her to do, or what she told him to do. She was actually the one that had the final say in how the kids were punished. So there is that. Now, yes, he did do the belt, but he did actually try to be on good terms with Ted. The animosity itself seems to come from Ted himself, because Ted viewed Johnny as somebody who wasn't very smart. He didn't think he had enough education, and he also didn't think he made enough money. Apparently that was very, very important to Ted. He did want to be seen as an upwardly mobile person, and his family was just middle class. This was not enough for Ted, and he placed the blame particularly on Johnny for this. Now, like I said, Johnny did work as a cook at the hospital, but he also had another side hustle. Ted, during this time when he was a teenager, by the time he was 14, did have a paper route. So Johnny, if he wasn't working in the mornings, would actually help Ted with his paper route. You know, it's kind of like a long paper route and it would take a long time to do. So he would help Ted out that way. And in return, in the afternoons, the two of them would actually go and pick beans together. So they did have a relationship somewhat. It just wasn't a close one. Ted was also a Boy Scout, and Johnny was actually one of the Scout leaders. An interesting thing about this, though, is that they would often go camping, and people remember that Ted would often make up excuses for why he couldn't go camping. He didn't appear to like camping. Ted wasn't particularly sporty in school. He was known to be very intelligent, though. I wouldn't say genius level. I believe his IQ was about 124. Just give me 1 second. I just want to make sure that I'm saying it right. Yeah, his IQ was about 124. So not genius level. He wasn't as smart as, say, Carla Homolka or Paris Bennett. If you guys have ever looked him up, oh my God, he was a 13-year-old and he murdered his own sister to hurt his mother. It's a long story. If you want me to cover it at some point in time, I'll look into it. But that guy had an IQ of 141. So Ted had an IQ of 124. That's smarter than most people. And his mother actually encouraged this for him, or Louise, his sister, his mother's sister, actually encouraged this. So when Ted was young, she would get him to put a certain percentage of his pay into an account because she knew that he was destined for better things. She knew he was destined to go to higher education, so college or university. So she did actually get him to actively save for this. So at some point in time, and I can't actually pinpoint when, because like I said, he tells different stories to different people. He did find out that Louise was his mother, and it appears to be sometime in his teens, but he did tell different people different things. So he suspected in his teens that Louise was actually his mother. And people do remember that sometimes he would call her Louise, or sometimes he would actually call her mother at this point in time, and actually for most of the rest of his life, because she never really confirmed it. She was still having him believe she was his older sister at this point in time. So according to Anne Rule, he somehow found out in his late teens that he was illegitimate, and this had a horrible effect on him. Okay, guys, for him to have found this out, for him to not know his father, maybe it gave him some relief to know that Johnny wasn't his father, but he was very angry and upset about it, and he was very shocked about it, guys. He was very angry at his mother about this. So part of me starts to wonder if this is where his hatred for women, because come on guys, he loved women but he hated them too, if that didn't have some bearing on his psyche. There are other people that say because he witnessed the abuses that Sam put on his wife, and also other like animals, that maybe that imprinted itself on his psyche when he was very young. However, there are other instances. So I can't pinpoint exactly when he found this out. He could have been 12 or 13 when he found it out. Liz, for her part, or on her part, said that Ted found out when he was like 17 or 18, and he found this out from one of his cousins. His cousin was calling him a bastard, just making fun of it, and Ted was like, no, I'm not. Like, how can you say this stuff about me? So according to Liz, which is according to Ted was shown his actual birth certificate by this cousin, which was stamped with illegitimate, and that's how he found out. And of course, he was very shocked and he was very disheartened. According to Liz, Ted actually wanted to go and confront Eleanor, but she talked him out of it. So he didn't go and do that at that point in time. I don't know if he ever really confronted his mother or if he just eventually let it go. According to Anne Rule, he didn't find out for sure, though. This is according to Anne Rule. Ted didn't find out for sure until he went to Vermont and checked out his actual birth records in 1969, when he was, what would he have been in 1969? 22. He wasn't quite 23, right? Because he's born in November. So who can say for sure? So Ted did seem like a pretty good kid, guys. He was working. He would babysit his brothers and sisters. Nobody recalls any real incidents at school. He was painfully shy, though. When he was a kid, he was actually really painfully shy. And he did, like I say, try out for sports. He wasn't very sporty. He did end up going out for track, and I guess he had some minor success with the hurdles, like the low hurdles, but he was never what you would consider a sporty kid. So he was more focused academically, and he did seem to achieve a B average. He was consistently a B student, which makes you wonder, right? Like, if he was so smart, how come he wasn't an A student? But anyway, he was consistently a B student. He did do well in school. He was teased in junior high by the other boys, though, and this would happen in gym class. Apparently they used to have communal showers, which kind of creeps me out, but apparently they used to have communal showers. I don't remember communal showers when I was a kid, but apparently they did have them, and the other boys would use them, of course, after gym class to shower off. There was a separate stall, though, if you were uncomfortable, and that's what Ted would use. Because he was so shy, he didn't want the other guys looking at him, and the other boys, because of this, would go up to him and like throw cold water on him. Sorry, it's not funny. And Ted would get really angry about this and be like really upset and chase them around. But he was teased for his shyness in junior high. He was still very, very shy. He wasn't quite the charismatic man that we know talked about today. He went to Woodrow Wilson High School in Tacoma, and he graduated in 1965. He was remembered actually as being pretty well known. He wasn't part of the popular crowd per se, but he was on the fringes of it. People would say he had, a fair amount of popularity. He was still shy, but he seemed to be well liked. People remembered him as being well dressed. He had good manners. He was a nice guy. If he did date, people weren't quite sure. They assumed he did. He seemed to be at school dances and have a date there, but people didn't really talk about his dating life at that point in time. He was, like I said, he was still shy. Not as painfully shy as in junior high, but he was still high. He did have an active interest in politics at this time. He wasn't on any student council. He wasn't part of student council at all. He wasn't a member of student council, but he did have a very high interest in politics. And he was actually academically a B+ student in high school. He was actually awarded a scholarship to the University of Puget Sound when he graduated in 1965. So though Ted seems relatively good, there were a few instances from his childhood. His Aunt Julia, who, if you remember, would have been 12 when Ted was born, so she would have been about 15 when this incident happened, remembers that one day she went to lay down and have a nap. When she woke up, there were various knives, kitchen knives of all shapes and sizes, surrounding her on the bed. And when she looked down, when she looked across from the foot of the bed, a smiling Ted was looking up at her. He was just so happy with what he had done. Ted had, of course, put the knives around her. It was very eerie, but she kind of brushed it off at that point in time. He's 3 years old, so no one really chalked it up to anything, but he was pretty proud of his handiwork. So he did have an affinity for knives, even going back that far. Maybe it was a consequence of what he saw Sam do, who can say for sure, but he did have an affinity for knives at that point in time. Ted was also known to the juvenile authorities, guys. He was on their radar. He was suspected of grand theft auto and burglary. He was never charged with them, but he was on the juvenile police radar at that point in time. No one could ever pin it down to him, but he was on their radar. And I do want you guys to know that Ted had a vast love of stealing. He loved to steal things. It was particularly fun for the thrill of it, but he also just wanted those possessions. His family didn't have the money, and he just thought he should have those possessions. I'm saying the word possessions for a very big reason. Ted thought of a lot of things as a possession, and that he wanted to have control over it. So Ted worked for Tacoma City Lights in the summer of 1965 before he went to university. And he spent the school year of 65-66 at the University of Puget Sound in Tacoma, Washington. He then worked at a sawmill in the summer of 1966, and then he transferred to the University of Washington. This was to study Chinese. He wanted to become fluent in Chinese because he figured that in the future, China in the 1960s was up and coming with business, and he figured if he could speak Chinese fluently, he could get more contracts that way, and it would be more helpful to him in white collar business. He was actually not wrong about this. We know that China is actually a superpower for a lot of manufacturing. And Ted was not wrong about the fact that if you are fluent in Chinese, you have a better go of it in big business. He was actually right about that. So at this point, like I said, 1967, Ted hadn't had any real serious relationships. He hadn't had a sexual partner, as far as I know of. Stephanie Brooks would be his first one. And she was the love of his life. He met Stephanie Brooks in 1967. This is according to Ted. So according to Ted, how much he can actually love. Okay. His shyness had held him back from having actual relationships with women. He may have dated, like I said before, we're not too sure. Yeah, you guys are, it's a soda day today. I'm sorry, guys. Much with Bernardo, it's a soda day. So just 1 second, guys. So Ted was held back by his shyness, but he was starting to develop characteristics. So he did meet Stephanie Brooks, and Stephanie Brooks to him represented the perfect woman. She was beautiful. She had long dark hair. Yeah, you got it. Long dark hair parted in the middle, that she wore down. I actually didn't mean to wear my hair like this today. And then I was like, oh my God, I can't believe I did it. She was slender. She came from a wealthy family in California. She had contacts. She was elegant. She had good manners. She had everything Ted Bundy was looking for in a woman, but also wanted for himself, right? Ted Bundy at this point in time wanted to be on the up and up. He wanted to appear upper crust, wealthy, which might have been why he presented with such good manners and being so well dressed when he went to high school, because he wanted that. He wanted to portray that to other people. He wanted to be wealthy. He wanted to be a good businessman, and he wanted these contacts, and Stephanie had all that. Now, at first, Ted thought that Stephanie wouldn't want to be with him because he figured she was better than him. She came from the upper crust. He came from the middle class. She had everything she wanted. She was elegant. She was polished. Ted was somewhat unpolished. He was actually at this point in time kind of drifting. You know, he didn't have a life plan, so to speak. He went from university to university, right? He didn't necessarily have a goal in mind, and that was bothersome to Stephanie. But she represented everything he wanted. So he became, I don't know if I want to say obsessed by her. I don't know if I want to say he fell in love with her either, because who knows, who can say for sure if he was in love with anybody, if he actually could feel that. Because like I said, he's been noted to be a psychopath without emotions. So who's to say for sure? But he wanted her nonetheless. And he often felt like she was better than him. So he was actually in awe of the fact that she was with him, that she dated him. She did have a good time with them. They didn't have a lot in common, but they did bond over mutual love of skiing. Apparently Ted took to this like a duck out of water, or like a duck in water. Can we say it that way? Like a duck in water. He really did love skiing, so that did become his sport. And Stephanie also loved skiing, so they did actually bond over this. From what I can say, she was his first sexual partner. And of course, Ted was in it to win it from that too. And he said that he did actually fall in love with Stephanie Brooks. While they were together, and they were together for about a year. I do want to point that out. They were together for approximately a year at this point in time. We're going to get into that at this point in time. They were together for about a year. Now, during that time, Ted had mostly menial jobs. I'm just going to bring up another picture of him, guys. Maybe. You guys know my computer. I just want to show you the one picture that, you know, we all kind of recognize when we're talking about Ted at this point in time. That is from high school, but, you know, Ted at this point in time. So he worked mostly low-paying jobs at this point in time, being a busboy for several different places. He was a shelf stalker. He worked as a stalker. He was actually a stalker. Ted Bundy was a stalker, guys. He would often watch women just like Paul Bernardo would, and he had done that since childhood as well. I believe when he was a teenager, just like Paul Bernardo. But he would also work as a stalker for a surgical supply store. I want you guys to keep that in mind. It's not going to come in handy in this film, but it will in other movies that we make. He worked as a shoe clerk and also as a legal messenger. He just worked menial, low-paying jobs at this point in time between university, between university semesters. He was noted as being fair, like a fair employee at some of these places. One of them said that he just didn't show up one day or he'd be late once in a while. But other jobs that he had said that he was, quote, a pleasant, dependable employee. End quote. Now, he was still actively stealing at this point in time. Remember what I said before? He stole for the thrill of it, guys. He stole whatever he could get his hands on. In fact, even Christmas gifts, when he gave gifts to people, Liz talked about this. They were stolen. And she would like see certain things in his apartment and know that they were stolen. That was a very big point of contention for the two of them. So Ted also befriended a widow during this time, and her name was Mrs. Sloan. They had worked together at one of the various places that had employed Ted at this point in time. One of the jobs that he held when he was a busboy, they had worked together. And she said that Ted could, quote, talk her into anything, end quote. So it seems like Mrs. Sloan is the first person that he showed this new side to. I don't know if maybe it was because he was dating Stephanie that suddenly he found this newfound confidence. He was becoming more confident at this point in time, more charismatic, more charming, more persuasive. All shyness at this point in time was completely out the window. He had transformed himself from being that shy, awkward kid to now being this charismatic, easily manipulative, easily persuasive man. So anyway, they worked together and she befriended him. They became friends, kind of like with what happened with Anne Rule later on. They befriended each other very quickly. And she would often help him out. Okay, guys, she would loan him her car. She would give him references. She would let him use her address when he was like applying for jobs instead of him applying from his, I think he was living at the university at that point in time. So instead of sending, I don't know why he would have done that, but instead of sending his mail with regards to jobs to the university, they'd send it to Mrs. Sloan's house. And she would also let him borrow money. Now, she was aware that he was entertaining women. So, okay, Liz was his perfect woman, but I do want to point out that this was another thing for Ted. He was not a serial monogamous, guys. When he was dating people, he was actually dating several people. Maybe she gave him the confidence to do so. Stephanie was his major love, but he would entertain other women at this place of business. She knew he was doing that, and she knew he was stealing too from coworkers. In fact, coworkers at this particular place did say that they knew somebody was stealing from their lockers. Things would show up missing, and they did suspect Ted, but they didn't really look into it from what I can tell. She was under his spell. She was one of the first people to be under his spell. Now, of course, when she wanted her money back and Ted wouldn't give it to her, she actually phoned Louise. And this is what Louise apparently told her, quote, "You're a fool to loan him money. You'll never get it back. He's a stranger around here," end quote. So apparently at this point in time, Ted did not have a very close relationship with his mother, well, with his sister, with her children, or with Johnny. It doesn't seem like they had a close relationship. He was still very fond of them, according to him. Like, see, Ted would tell people, though, that he was very close to his mother and his siblings. But at this point in time, it seems like maybe he was just too busy in life to be at home very often. So she never did get the money back. I just want to point that out. And like I said, he was kind of ashamed of his family. They weren't as smart as him in his way of thinking. They weren't well educated. They hadn't gone on to higher education, and they just didn't have the money. And Ted didn't want people to see him as not upwardly mobile. So by all accounts, or by her account, Stephanie did, how do I describe this? She did love Ted in a way. So she did have love for Ted, but it was not in the way that Ted had love for her. Okay, she had romantic feelings for him, but in her estimation, Ted was far more in love with her than she ever was with him. There were things about Ted that bothered her. Part of it was the money, okay? But a larger part of that was the fact that Ted seemed so aimless. Like, he went from university to university. He went from job to job. These were low-paying jobs. And Stephanie wanted to be with somebody who was upwardly mobile, somebody who more fit into her lifestyle, right? She was from a wealthy family in California. And it could have been pressure from her parents too, right? You marry within your class at that point in time. Sometimes still today, but you guys know what I mean. Like, you're upwardly mobile, you need to marry somebody that was upwardly mobile. I don't know if it was pressure from her family, but she did say that Ted just seemed to be too aimless at this point in time. She also suspected that Ted was a user and that he made himself close to people that he figured he could get favors from. He made himself close to people that he could easily manipulate. She figured he was a user, guys. She figured he used people, and she was right. She also felt that he was very manipulative and that he would take advantage of unsuspecting targets if they let him. So you're seeing the manipulation part of his personality was very present at this point in time. She also figured he was a liar, and of course he was. We know he was. He lied about most things. He'll lie in one way, tell the truth, lie, tell the truth. So you're never quite certain. Even in his confessions, guys, he'd tell something but retract it, or he'd tell something but in the third person, so it wasn't him. Or he'd tell something to one part of law enforcement and then deny it to another. That was just Ted's way. She also felt that he was, quote, too indecisive, too emotional, and too unsure of himself at this time, end quote. So she didn't see that their relationship was going to go anywhere. She didn't see him as the marrying type, let's just say, at this point in time. I just want to keep pointing that out. They did. Now, Ted had actually gotten a scholarship to study Chinese because he had done very well in it at Stanford University. At this point in time, so in 1968, he'd gotten the scholarship to study Chinese at Stanford, but this wasn't good enough for Stephanie, I guess. So they did date throughout the summer of 1968, but she wanted to be done with him. She did have fun with him. She fully acknowledges she had fun with him, but she just didn't see it as going anywhere. And she was at this point in her life where she wanted to be more settled down. I don't think I mentioned it before, but Stephanie was actually older than Ted. I think she was a year older than Ted. So maybe she was ready to settle down at this point in time. I'm sure Ted would have settled down with her. I mean, by all accounts, according to him, he was in love with her. I'm just going to keep air quoting it, but she was the perfect woman for him. But she just didn't see it as right. She just didn't see their relationship as being on the up and up. She told him at the end of that summer that she saw them as being on two life paths. So she broke it off with him. And this devastated Ted because it also cemented, first of all, because he lost his first love. But second of all, it cemented in his mind that he wasn't good enough for her. Remember, at the start of their relationship, he didn't feel he had enough to offer her and that he wasn't good enough for her. So this actually cemented that in his mind. And a part of this could come from the fact that he's illegitimate too, because a lot of illegitimate children were made to feel, because of the stigma and because of how they were treated by others, or felt because they didn't have a father, that they were less than legitimate children. So that's almost like two blows in one, I guess. So he returned to Seattle in that fall. He gave up Stanford and he was done. He didn't even care about studying Chinese anymore. He was done caring about certain things. He just didn't have it in him at this point in time. He was really jaded and he just didn't have an interest in anything. So he became even more aimless at this point in time. At least he had ambitions before. in 1968, it doesn't seem like, it seems like it seems like he was depressed. Although he still did care about politics to some degree. And you'll get into that. We'll get into that. But he still seemed to care about politics at least. So in April of 1968, he actually helped run the presidential campaign for a man named Rockefeller. I think his first name is Al, but I'm not completely sure. Sorry, guys. I did know it, but I just wrote down the name Rockefeller. You can look it up. As such, he won a trip to the Miami presidential convention. So Rockefeller was a Republican candidate, but he was more like a progressive Republican candidate. I think they'd call him independent on today's circle. He was not the top Republican candidate. I think that was actually Richard Nixon at that point in time. So anyway, he was throwing his hat in for this, and Ted did work on his campaign. He helped to run his campaign. Of course, like we know, in 1968, he didn't make the president. He wasn't voted in, but he did become vice president in 1974 under Richard Nixon. So Ted took classes in Seattle. So he was still taking classes. He still would go to university in sociology and urban planning. Sociology. But he didn't do well in them. Odd. He didn't do well in that aspect. Maybe he just couldn't study human action or interactions. There could be reasons for that. A true psychopath is not very good with human interactions. On the surface they are, but underneath they just don't fully understand them because they don't have the emotions we do. However, Ted was able to have long-term friendships. Mrs. Sloan, they remained friends for a long time. He remained friends with his landlords. At this point in time, he was renting a place in Tacoma. I believe it was still in Tacoma. I don't think he was living in Seattle at this point in time, from a German couple. And he was like a son to them. He stayed very close with them for 5 years. He did live until he moved to Utah, actually. So, I mean, he was able to have friendships. He was still very good friends with one of his friends from high school. Anne Rule and him stayed friends for many years, or at least friendly for many years. So he was able to maintain friendships. That's why I say I don't know if I can call him a true psychopath. But anyway, we're getting off topic right now. Sorry, guys. So he took these classes. He didn't do very well. He then became and so he dropped out, obviously. He then became a driver for Art Fletcher. And Art Fletcher was a candidate for lieutenant governor of Washington State. Sorry, I'm trying to get it right, guys. And Ted later on also became his bodyguard. And he wanted Al Fletcher to approve him to be able to wear a gun. Because he was working as the bodyguard, but Al Fletcher said, no, you're not allowed to have the gun. So he didn't. Fletcher did lose the election at this point in time. Now, early in 1969, Ted did enroll in Temple University in Philadelphia. Okay, so he tried his hand at another university. So at this point in time, he's been University of Washington, University of Puget Sound. He's been to a couple different universities and for various things, right? Not always the same program. Now he's enrolling himself at Temple University in Philadelphia. He only stayed for a semester and then he dropped out of there too. So in 1969, though, in the spring summer of 1969, Ted set out to find out his actual parentage. So he did go to Vermont and he was able to see his birth records. So this proved to him that at 22 years of age, he actually did find out, this was the definitive proof where he found out that Eleanor was not his sister, Louise was not his sister, but was actually his mother, and that he really was illegitimate. However, I guess he was given this Lloyd Marshall's name. It was on those records, but he was stamped as illegitimate. Obviously, his parents were married. It did bother Ted, and he was very angry at his mother. The stigma of illegitimacy, he told to all of his friendship relationships with. Louise knew about it. Stephanie knew about it. Anne Rule knew about it. It wasn't like he shied away from this. He did tell people he was illegitimate. He did tell people it bothered him, that in some ways it made him feel like less than, that he was angry with his mother about this, but at the same point in time, when he talked to Anne Rule about it, she said, you know, your mother was just trying to do what was best for you so that you wouldn't have this stigma. And he was like, yeah, I understand that. But his mother never revealed anything to him, guys. Never. She just didn't talk about it with him ever. So it did bother him. But it doesn't seem like he ever went on an active search to find out who his real father was. I think that was just good enough for him. It doesn't look like he ever tried to fully find out who his father was. Now, at this point in time, the illegitimacy did confirm to him his feelings of being less than, but it also seemed to provoke in him not just more feelings of anger towards women, and it's almost like these are key parts to his life. So I want you to keep them in mind. There's nothing confirmed from this time, but there are hints that he may have murdered at this point in time and earlier than this, which we will get into. But it seemed to almost solidify into him that because he was less than, he needed more control over the other aspects of his life. Mainly keeping certain parts of his life compartmentalized from other parts. He did that, right? He was able to easily do that. He was actively killing people, but still dating Liz. He was actively killing people, but still talking to Anne Rule. I'm just saying. He compartmentalized certain parts of his life. But I think this almost imbued in him the feeling that because he couldn't control that part of his life, he needed to make up for that in other areas. So he more wanted to control everything. Control what his possessions were going to be, control what his personal life looked like or sounded like, control women, control who he dated, not control like abusively, but have that person in his life. And it's not so much about who he dated, but his victims himself. He would talk about this later on, that they were possessions to him and he needed to have total control over them, including after death. But we're getting ahead of ourselves again. So Ted Bundy at this point in time, I didn't describe his looks. He was about 6 foot. He was considered very handsome for that point in time. He had blue eyes. He had brownish hair. Sometimes it was curly. Sometimes he cut it so that it wasn't. And he had an athletic build. Despite being not super athletic, he did love things like rafting and water sports of that nature. And of course, he did love skiing. He had a very charming smile. He seemed like an easygoing man. People said that he was still well dressed, and of course he still had very impeccable manners. He was always well dressed because he stole the clothes, but people remember that about him. And of course, sometimes he would speak in a British or Canadian. Some people called it a Canadian accent. I don't see myself as having an accent, but maybe you guys do. I don't know. But they would say that about him. He would put these things on. It was easy for him to try on different hats. And he was considered very good looking for that time period. I'm sure he still would be considered good looking, but the unibrow, guys, like he would have had to manscape. I'm sorry, but I can't get over the unibrow. Every time I look at him, I'm like, the unibrow. Anyway, I'm getting off topic. So he was considered very handsome, and he could have pretty much any woman that he desired. At least he could take them out and date them. However, he still desired Stephanie. He still really wanted Stephanie Brooks. He once again, he kept in contact with Stephanie. It was more that he would write her. She didn't always contact him back. So it was like he kept in contact with her during this point in time. And in 1969, he figured he could get back together with her. He was still aimless and rootless. He still wasn't actively pursuing a particular degree. He still didn't have a very well-paying job, nothing like that. But he figured he could get back together with her, and he surprised her outside of a building that she had been working at this point in time, and she, of course, mildly rejected him. It wasn't like, no, Ted, no. It was just more like, no, we're still not on the same life path, because she still saw that he was aimless. So at this point in time, Ted, who had actively felt the sting of rejection from her and the sting of being illegitimate, decided to do something about it. He was going to make over his life. He was ambitious, so he figured he was going to turn himself into a success. There are other reasons why he did this, and we will get into them in a little bit, but he figured he was going to turn his life around. He was going to start to become the man he wanted to be. He was going to throw himself more into his studies. He was going to try to find better paying jobs. He was going to throw himself into his studies so he could have well-paying jobs, things of that nature. He was determined to become successful and wealthy. He was determined to show Stephanie he could do this. He was determined to show her he could be the kind of man she wanted. So he started classes once again at the University of Washington, this time studying psychology. That probably came in handy for him later on, I'm just saying. But this time studying psychology, and he became an honor student. So no longer the B+ student, he was now an A student. He sincerely threw himself into these studies, although he seemed to also like psychology as well. He had glowing recommendations from his teachers, one of whom actually wrote, quote, "Mr. Bundy is undoubtedly one of the top undergraduate students in our department," end quote. And he also wrote, quote, "I would place him in the top 1% of undergraduate students," quote. And when I'm talking undergraduate students, I'm talking about undergraduate students that this professor had ever taught. He placed Ted Bundy in the top 1% of that. So he was very good. He had a high amount of academic prowess at this point in time. So during this time, he was still stealing. Of course, he still kept that up. And he was still telling lies, especially about his parentage to people. So he would tell one person, I found out at this point in time, you saw this, right? Between Anne Rule and Liz. He'd tell people one story about his parentage, tell people another story. Sometimes he was a foster child. Sometimes he was an orphan, things of this nature. He would just lie like this. And these would be lies he especially told to people that were kind of on the outskirts of his life, that were not from his family or in his deep inner circle, let's just say. In the fall of 1969, he finally met the woman who would become very instrumental in his life, guys. She would actually become very instrumental in the case as well, but we can't get into that until the next video. And this was Liz Cloffer. Liz Kendall, according to her book. Once again, it's a pseudonym, and she is referred to, even in Anne Rule's book, by a different name. She deserves her anonymity. I mean, it's got to be, it was an immense shock for her to find out what Ted Bundy actually was, as well as it was for Anne Rule. So they met at a bar and they were instantly drawn to each other. Liz was a little bit older than Ted. He liked that. She had already been divorced. She had a 3-year-old daughter. She refers to her as Molly, so we'll call her Molly. She does have parts in the story. I do find it kind of interesting that in his actual dating life, Ted preferred to date older women, but his victims were usually younger than him. I do find that interesting. Actually, all of his victims would have been younger than him. Sorry, guys, one second. I think he may have chosen the younger victims because they more accurately looked like Stephanie, right? That he had a victim type base, and it was based on how Stephanie had looked. Usually long dark hair, not always, some of them were blonde, but long hair, parted in the middle, worn down. That's why he, slender build, that was his victim type. Some of them, most of them were tall, but some of them were shorter too. And he could have chose those particular, he probably did choose those particular victims because they looked a lot like Stephanie had when they first started dating. So Liz was everything that Stephanie wasn't. She was accepting of Ted. She was a hardworking person. She actually was a secretary, just like his mother was. And she was not well, I think she was very pretty, but she described herself as not particularly beautiful. Ted found her good looking. And she believed in him. She believed, unlike Stephanie, she believed he could achieve anything he wanted. She believed, she was deeply in love with him. Liz was deeply, deeply in love with Ted Bundy. She would listen to anything he had to say. She was a support system for him. She would support him financially as well as emotionally too. So she was everything that Stephanie wasn't, let's just say. And they clicked and they dated for a very, very, very long time, guys. She deeply loved Ted, and I do believe Ted, for his part, did feel a certain love for her. He did love her. He loved her in the friend sense. He did love her in a romantic sense, but not as much as he had loved Stephanie. Liz herself was actually the daughter of a wealthy doctor, and Ted knew this too. And Liz did figure at certain points in time that Ted was using her because of this. And that's why Ted was with her, was because her family had money. Remember, he loves him some money. So this was especially evident when she took him home for Christmas with her family, but he was good to her, and he was a very good, seemingly very good father figure for Molly. He did actually take an active role in Molly's life. He did seem, for all intents and purposes, to love Molly too. She figured, though, Liz still figured he was seeing other women, and she was right. He always was seeing other women. That was just one of his things. I guess as soon as he discovered that he had that magnetic pull towards women, he used it. So from 1969 to 1970, Ted was doing very well in academics and in his social life. He was no longer that shy, awkward kid. All of that was gone. He was now charming. He was now charismatic. He was handsome. He was dynamic. Apparently, according to Liz, he was very good in bed. They had a very active sex life. At that point in time, there was no weirdness to it. He didn't ask her to do anything untoward. That would come a little bit later. We'll get into that in another video. And he became the ideal man. He even got a commendation, guys, from the Seattle police because he saved a boy from drowning. He saved a toddler from drowning. And this was another part of Ted's duality. Though he was planning on doing evil things, and though he was stealing and doing criminal things, he would also be brave at times, or he would help people out. He often warned Anne Rule not to, he would walk her to her car door because he didn't want anything to happen to her. He always warned her to be safe. He was very chivalrous too, very gentlemanly. But he also, he would stop purse snatchers and things of that nature. He was known to help people out. He also did save some lives, guys. He worked at a crisis clinic. We'll get into that. So at some point in time, Ted had moved to Seattle proper. Seattle has a population of, sorry guys, just give me 1 second, 753,675. That's as of 2019. And it's the largest city in Washington. You guys hear about Seattle all the time. It's the birthplace of grunge. It's also the birthplace of Bill Gates and Amazon. I love Amazon. You guys should know. I do love me some Amazon. And there were approximately, it looks like 52 murders in Seattle in 2020 or 2019. So it does have a high crime rate to it. So this duality. So Ted introduced Liz around as his girlfriend. For all intents and purposes, she was his girl. They were together. He introduced Molly to people. Her family knew him. His family knew her, his good friends, all of that. And everyone figured that they'd eventually get married at some point in time, particularly because he seemed to dote so much on Molly. He really did seem to love Molly. In fact, even when she was 5 years old, he for her 5th birthday, he actually baked her and decorated her a cake. There's another thing about Ted Bundy. Apparently, he was also a gourmet cook. He was very, very good at cooking, and he loved to cook, just to let you guys know. So he actually baked her birthday cake and decorated the house for Molly for her 5th birthday. But he was still seeing other women. And he and Liz would often fight about this because she knew about it. Liz, for her own part, would try to make Ted jealous. And she did actually date a couple other guys. And it did provoke him. They did have conversations about it. And he's like, well, I would prefer that you didn't see other men. But I guess if you feel like it, that's your prerogative type thing. But then he'd go and watch them while they were dating, and he would get mad about it. So they did date. They always she would get mad at him for seeing other women because she knew, but they always ended up back together. They always came back together. They drifted back together. They were pulled back together in some way. So Liz wanted to be married, but Ted did hold back from this. They would become engaged, or he would refer to her as his fiance, or they'd talk about marriage during the years of their relationship, but it was nothing really super serious, I guess, guys. It was never like they set a date. Well, they did, but they didn't. We'll get into it. So in 1971, Ted took the LSATs because he wanted to go to law school. He did actively want to be a lawyer at this point in time, but he didn't do well on the tests. Apparently, Ted Bundy was known for not doing well on tests. He was very good academically. He had a good IQ, but he wasn't able to articulate that very well, despite how much he studied in tests, in the testing areas. So he applied to several different law programs, and he actually got into the University of Utah law program. So he was excited about it, but not. The reason being was that he'd actually been rejected from every other law program he applied to, and this devastated him. This upset him, but not like angry, I'm going to go out and kill. Well, maybe. Who's to say for sure, but not like angry, oh my God, they're so terrible. He was more upset with himself for not doing well. So technically speaking, the University of Utah was the only law program that accepted him in. So at this point in time, he decided to take a year off so that he could get further work experience. In 1971, Ted got a paid work-study job at the Seattle Crisis Clinic, and it was here he would be answering phones for people in crisis, okay? So people who had OD'd, people who were thinking of suicide, people who were the victims of crime, rape victims, anybody who was in crisis, but particularly suicides and ODs would call in. And that's why I say Ted Bundy saved lives. Anne Rule said it too. She said, yeah, I was there when he did. He could talk people off of a wall. So he did save some lives, guys. He took a lot of lives, but he saved a lot of lives too. Very strange, the duality of Ted Bundy. So like I said before, in 1971, this is where he met Anne Rule. Ted was working the 9 p.m. to 9 a.m. shift, and I believe he worked 5 days a week. Anne Rule worked the 10 p.m. to 2 a.m. shift, and this was only on Tuesdays and Sundays, but she was partnered up with Ted Bundy. Now, Ted was about 10 years younger than Anne at this point in time. And Anne was the mother of children at this point in time. She was going through a divorce as well. Or she had separated from her husband at this point in time. I don't know if they were legally divorced yet. But she and Ted became very fast friends. And when I say they stayed friends for a long time, they did. Because Ted would write to her from prison. She had a very hard time with this because she knew Ted, but she didn't know Ted, and she fully acknowledges that. He would write to her from prison. He would call her too. They had the type of friendship where they may not talk for a while, but when they did speak, it was like picking up and being old times. So even Anne though, couldn't spot any type of malice in Ted at that point in time. She couldn't spot it. And she had been a police officer prior to this. She had been a police officer before in Seattle, but she didn't suspect anything untoward from Ted at this point. To her, he was just a kind, concerned friend. So like I said, remember, he would walk her to her car after her shift because he didn't want anything to happen to her. She liked him from the very start. And she did agree that he saved a lot of lives. She also said that he was very, very easy to talk to. He was a very gentle listener and a very concerned listener. You know, when the phones weren't ringing, you guys, I'm sure will do this with colleagues too at workplaces. Oh my God, I just lost my earring. It's always something. Something is always falling off me. My eyelash, my earring. But like I said, you know, you guys talk with your coworkers about things, and sometimes you share with them things you wouldn't tell other people because you are so close from working together. And your colleagues become your best friends, right? They become very good friends. I'm lucky enough that my the people I worked with, some of them are my very best friends. They're good friends that I share things with, and still to this day will share things with. There's no judgment there. And she never felt that from Ted. There was no judgment. She could literally tell him anything. She said, quote, "You could tell things to Ted that you might never tell anyone else," end quote. He just had that way about him. Now, it was probably for his own intents and purposes, and working at the crisis clinic may have been too. It was so that he could, I should say maybe, because these are my own thoughts, maybe it was so that he could get information on how to not do things the way other perpetrators did them. Regardless. So in 1971, Liz did actually get pregnant. This is a piece of information I didn't know. Ted was actually excited about it, but Liz at that point in time did not feel comfortable with bringing another baby into the world. She didn't feel like their life was sound enough. Like, first of all, the two of them aren't married. But second of all, I think it was more that they didn't have the jobs that they wanted to have at that point in time, that they just didn't have the money. It just wasn't the right timing, let's just say. So she did have an abortion. Ted was actually very helpful to her when she had the abortion, but he was struggling at that point in time with the fact that though he was seeing Liz and though he had love for Liz, he was still obsessed with Stephanie. He still had deep feelings for Stephanie, and he still was seeing Stephanie as well. He actually talked about this with Anne Rule, and Anne Rule told him, you know, Ted, you're going to have to decide at some point in time who you want to be with. You can't do this to those two women. It's not fair. And Ted did acknowledge this. He did say, quote, about Stephanie, "She's the only woman I ever really loved. It's different from the way I feel about Liz. It's hard to explain," end quote. So, like I said, Ted would admit to being jealous if Liz dated other men, but he was still hung up on Stephanie. In June of 1972, Ted actually graduated with honors from the University of Washington. So this was with a degree in psychology. And in 1972, Ted started to date another woman, okay? And it enraged Liz, but once she found out about it, Ted was with this woman for a little while. He didn't really keep it hidden at that point in time, but when Ted and this other woman broke up, he came back to Liz and told her, you know, it just wasn't right. I need to be with you. I feel like we're meant to be together, those type of things, right? He was a really good talker. He was good at that. So Liz took him back once again. I think he liked that women seemed very willing to date him. I think he liked that at this point in time. He seemed to... He seemed to like dating around, let's just say. So... Sorry, guys. He actually worked on Governor Dan Evans's re-election campaign in 1972, and he was a volunteer at this point in time. He had hoped it would become a paying position, but it didn't. And in early 1973, because Ted Evans had, oh God, I want to call him, sorry, Dan Evans had won, Ted and Liz in early 1973 attended his inauguration ball together. So Ted also worked briefly at the Seattle Crime Commission. This was mostly for a study of white-collar crime. And he even wrote a pamphlet about rape. And I think it was for the Crime Commission at this point in time as well. In fact, he contacted Anne to try to see if she could get him some information from the police, right? She had various contacts within the police force, both due to her writing. At this point in time, she was writing for true crime and detective magazines, but also because of the fact that she had been a police officer before. And she forgot about it because she wasn't, she didn't think she could give the information, but eventually she forgot about it because her own life got so busy. But Ted did produce a pamphlet for rape. Think about that for a minute. The rapist doing this, providing a pamphlet about rape. So he also worked for the King County budget, and he made a lot of money finally. He was finally able to make a lot of money. He was comfortable. I shouldn't say a lot, but he was comfortable. And at this point in time, he was able to afford a car. And wouldn't you know it, but it was a 1969 brown Volkswagen Beetle. Some people describe it as beige or tan. I'm going to say it's brown. You can see pictures of it. It's actually at one of the crime museums. It does look a lot to be like a tan or a brown, a beige colored Volkswagen. And it was actually Liz that helped him pick it out in the spring of 1973. So during that spring of 73, he was also appointed assistant chairman of the Washington State Republican Central Committee. So he was really making good money at this point in time. However, he still continued to steal. He could not stop himself. That was a major bone of contention in his relationship with Liz, the fact that he would steal so often. So, and like I said, he was a chameleon, guys. He could be a chameleon with his looks. All he had to do was cut his hair, and he could look completely different from before. He could grow a beard, look completely different, grow a mustache, completely different. He could always, just one little change in his hair or facial appearance, and he could look like a completely different person. And this is why I think so many witnesses or victims that he wasn't able to kill, I think this was why they had a harder time picking him out. Witnesses especially, because when a sketch would come out about him, he would change his appearance just by cutting his hair, and he could look completely different. There are a lot of people that can attest to the fact that he could be a chameleon with his looks. Ted applied to law school again at the University of Utah again. So even though he didn't have stellar test marks, he did have his immaculate academic records. He had letters of recommendations from many professors. He had a letter of recommendation from Governor Dan Evans himself. And he had a very expansive resume, right? He'd worked for the budget. He'd worked for several committees. He'd worked in politics. So he was an up and coming person. So he was able to get into law school through this. However, he deferred, and he said it was because he got into a really bad car accident at that point in time. And so he wouldn't be able to go to school. Now, he did get into an accident over the summer, and he actually did total Liz's car because he was known to also drive Liz's car. Her car was red. I'll try to put that in the next video, guys. I didn't actually write down the make of her car, but he would drive her car. So he did get into an accident. He did total her car, but he only had a sprained ankle. He just walked away with a sprained ankle. So it's kind of weird that he told that lie, but he did. And he deferred from taking classes at this point in time. So he did start law school in the fall of 1973, but it wasn't at the University of Utah. It was at the University of Puget Sound in Tacoma. Once again, he started law school there. It was night school that he was going to. In 1973, though, at this point in time, unbeknownst to anybody else, including Liz, Ted Bundy became secretly engaged to Stephanie Brooks. Yes, that's right. They had dated for that whole long time. She was suddenly drawn in. I mean, now Ted was a successful man. He had money. He was going to law school. He was no longer aimless. He had specific goals in mind. They were lofty goals. He seemed ready to achieve them. He was charismatic. He was charming. He seemed to not be manipulating people anymore, even though he was. She didn't see it anymore. He was everything she wanted him to be. He was everything she was looking for in a man now. So readily, she agreed to marry him. And this had been his plan all along, guys. So as soon as basically she agreed to marry him, they spent Christmas together. She described him as cold during the Christmas season, irritated, edgy. He was distant from her, not the man he had been before, so ardently in love. Now he's very dismissive of her, to the point that in early 1974, she was like, well, then I guess we're not going to get married anymore, because he had been treating her so distantly and disdainfully. And he said, yeah, that's fine. Because that was his plan all along, guys. His plan was to get revenge on Liz. Or sorry, not on Liz, on Stephanie. The reason why he had thrown himself so ardently into his work was not just so he could gain success, but it was so that he could get Stephanie to come back to him, so he could break her heart just like she had broken his. He wanted that revenge. That's the reason Stephanie believes it happened. That's the reason other people believe it happened. That's the reason why I believe it happened. He literally did all these things. Well, because he did want to be successful as well, I mean, but he literally threw himself into his work at that point in time just so he could screw her over later on. That's what he wanted to do. So perhaps it could be at this point in time that he thought that maybe if he put his revenge plan into action and he finally got his revenge on Stephanie, that his life would be good. Even though his life was good at this point in time. He was in law school. He was, I mean, secretly engaged to the woman of his dreams, according to him, but he was also dating a very dependable woman. He was friends with a lot of people. He had a very good job, working in politics, all of these things, guys, but it wasn't enough for Ted. Maybe he thought that getting revenge on Stephanie would make it enough for him, would give him that edge he needed. Maybe he thought that getting revenge on her would curb his darker desires, but it seems that that was the tipping point for him. That when he finally did get his revenge, it unleashed something even darker in him. Maybe. We have to get to that. It was almost like, because he gave himself permission to get revenge on Stephanie, and because he'd like put the plan into action and he'd actually achieved it, that he now gave himself permission to do all the other things he wanted to do. Or because he'd been able to fake out Stephanie and make her believe he wanted to marry her, maybe it boosted him into thinking that he could do anything he felt like. So for all intents and purposes, Ted was successful at this point in time. He was handsome. He was young. He had a good partner. He had two good partners, really, I guess. He seemed to be a doting father to Liz's daughter. And he had a political career. And it was a good one, too. He was making money. He had lots of good contacts, too, within the upper class, right? He'd had several good jobs. He knew powerful people, all of these things. He was still a student, and it seemed entirely likely that he was well on his way to becoming a good lawyer. And that was a dream of his at this point in time, guys. He really did want to become a lawyer, the best lawyer that he possibly could be. And it seemed like he could achieve this. But you know, he'd finally gotten over his older shynesses. He had lost and then re-won. I can't say that. That's very hard for me to say. The love of his life, quote unquote, for all intents and purposes. And he'd gotten revenge on her for dumping him as cruelly as she had. So it just looked like he had all of his shit, his stuff together at this point in time. Yet he wanted more. He needed more. He needed more in his life. Maybe he needed more thrills, maybe revenge. Just, he was like, yeah, I got this. So now I can finally go and do all the other things I wanted to do. However, we're not sure when he started doing those things. So he may have been doing them for quite a while before. He was still lying. He was still double dealing Liz and Stephanie. He was still stealing. He was still manipulating people. He was still using people for favors. He was still doing all of these things. And he was on the periphery of his own family. He was able to charm and manipulate people just like I said he was. And nobody seemed to know that. Maybe it seemed like only a handful of people were on to the fact that he would use and manipulate people. Most other people didn't see it coming. If they did suspect Ted of any wrongdoing, he was easily able to lie himself out of the situation and make those people believe in him again. He did it to Liz a number of times. He was easily able to do that. In early January of 1974, so this would be January 4th of 1974, an 18-year-old woman named Karen Sparks She is also known as Jody Lentz. So it's a pseudonym, guys. I'm not even sure if Karen Sparks is her real name. She was identified that way, but she's known by more than one name. Was attacked in her sleep violently. Someone had snuck into her room at night and beaten her with a metal rod from her own bed frame, like literally taken it off, beaten her severely with it, to the point that she was in a coma for 10 days and has suffered severe brain damage, guys. She has no recollection of the attack at all. Plus she was sleeping too, right? So it's not like she had saw him come in. And he also shoved the metal rod up her vagina. He violated her with it sexually to the point where she was like actually ruined inside. I don't think she could have any children as well. So she spent 10 days in the coma, but she wasn't one of the lucky ones, guys. This is the first confirmed attack for Ted Bundy, the first confirmed one. He didn't kill her outright. She did survive, but she was never able to identify him, right? Because she can't remember what happened. So on January 31st of 1974, some sources do point to it being February 1st. In fact, a lot of the articles online will say it was February 1st, but both Anne Rule and Liz Kendall, or Liz Cloffer, say that it was January 31st of 1974, so I'll go with that date. 21-year-old Linda Ann Healy disappeared. She was a student at the University of Washington. And she worked at the local radio station. So she actually did the weather reports in the early morning hours. So she would leave her house, 4:30, 5:30 in the morning, and she rode her bike to work. She was highly dependable, guys. She was always there. And if she wasn't going to be there, she would call in. She was one of those good people that would do things like that. She was not a runaway. She was never known to hitchhike. She was a very cautious person by nature. And when she didn't come in, her coworkers knew something was wrong. So they contacted her roommates, and the roommates contacted police, and the police came to her home. Now, her bedroom was very tidy and the bed was made, but her roommates said that it was made in a way that Linda would never make it. The bedding was tucked under the pillows, and Linda pulled it up on top of the pillows. Regardless, when they took the bedding down, the bedding was pulled up over the pillows, and Linda would put it under the pillows. Kind of like what I do. You guys can see it, right? Mine's over the pillows, but Linda put it underneath. So when they pulled back the bedding, they noticed that the pillows were bloodstained, but that the case themselves was missing from the pillows, and there was blood on the bedding underneath that had actually soaked through to the mattress. Not enough to say that somebody had died from it, but to the point where police believed that this person had been beaten unconscious. Her nightgown, which was oddly hung up in her closet, also had blood, like a ring of blood around the neck. So it appeared that the person that attacked her made her get dressed or dressed her. She was likely unconscious, so they figured that this person dressed her. Her knapsack was missing, and like I said, some clothes and the pillowcase itself were also missing from her room. So whoever had taken her had beaten her and removed her night clothes and redressed her. I think it was in a blouse, jeans, and boots. Approximately 3 days later, 911 received a phone call from a person saying that this was a male, saying that the person who attacked Karen, or Jody, and the person who took Linda were the same person. What's more, this person said, quote, "He was outside both houses. He was seen," end quote. Then, of course, he refused to give his name and he hung up. So could this person have been Ted? Anne Rule kind of believes it was Ted that called this in. Why call police, though? Why would Ted call police? Maybe to find out what they knew or try to get some information. Maybe to find out, to see if they already knew that it was the same person. It was almost like he outed himself, though, because people would have believed maybe they were in the university district, these attacks were, but maybe they would have thought it was two different perpetrators. I don't know. I mean, it's kind of a similar crime. He'd snuck into these people's houses, but regardless. Ted, like I said before, was a stalker and a peeper. Okay, not a stalker like he just stalked women. He'd watched them for a while. He was a peeping Tom, just like Paul Bernardo. They both were. And they would stalk their victims through this. They'd peep on them for a while, long enough for Ted to realize, for Ted to know that Linda and her roommates hid a key in their mailbox just in case somebody forgot it or just in case somebody needed to come in. And that's how he got in, right? So Donna Gail Manson was 19. She was a girl known to hitchhike, and she often up and left when the urge hit her. So much like Linda and like Karen before her, she had long hair that was parted in the middle and she wore down. She was a student at Evergreen State College, much like both Karen and Linda were students at the University of Washington. And was supposed to go to a jazz concert at 8 o'clock, I believe that night. I believe it was 8 o'clock. She was supposed to be there on campus on March 12th of 1974. She never showed up to the jazz concert. A friend reported her missing a few days later. Now, this is because she was known to hitchhike, right? So some people thought that when she didn't go to the jazz musical, it's because she decided to go to another place and that she'd hitchhike there. She would often leave on a whim whenever she felt like, but she was never gone for a long, long time. That's why she was reported missing. It was just too long for her to have been gone. So she was Ted's second confirmed killing. He was now a serial predator because he didn't kill his first victim. Okay. He didn't kill the first person that was confirmed to be his first attack. He was definitely now a serial predator. He selected most of his victims due to due to their looks, due to the fact that they looked a lot like Stephanie Brooks had. They all had, long hair that they wore parted in the middle, and they wore it down. Some of them were blonde, but a majority of them were brunette. They were slender. All of them were slender women. Some of them, he abducted them, most of them, off of college campuses or university campuses or in the university area. He also, a lot of them were tall, but some of them were on the shorter side. So it particularly seems like he was targeting students with long dark hair pointed in the middle, or parted in the middle. Sorry, guys. And that right there is where we're going to leave it for today. So we did get into some of his kills. What started Ted on this journey, though, guys? What do you think started Ted on this journey? For one, I believe it could have gone back to childhood. I believe he could have seen something that Sam had done that messed with his psyche. However, if he was a psychopath, he was born that way. It's hard to say. There were some incidences, though. We know that the trauma caused by the breakup of Stephanie, he and Stephanie Brooks, did cause him to disassociate for a while, right? He was aimless for a long while after that. He couldn't make up decisions. He'd lost interest in most things. We also know that the fact that he found out he was illegitimate at some point in time, and that his sister was actually his mother. I know it's mind-blowing. And that he didn't know who his father was. That had a profound effect on him too. But we can't say for sure when his crime started. But what do you think made him snap out like that? What do you think made him, I guess, accelerate it so much in 1974 to boom, 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 boom attacking time? Because he carried this on for a while. So what do you think drove him to that point? He got his revenge on Stephanie. Don't you think he would have felt that he had his stuff together? But it seems like at that point in time, despite the fact that he got that revenge, he felt the need to go further. He felt the need to do more. When did these urges start? What do you think these urges start? There is some evidence that points to the fact that these urges could have started as early as 1961 when Ted was 14. There was an 8-year-old girl. Her name was Anne Marie Burr, and she disappeared from her own home, guys, from her own bed, basically. It's not like he came in and took her from the bed, because the family remembers her sister woke up she had a broken arm, I believe, so her arm was bothering for the night. She woke up at least twice. The first time she woke up, when her parents brought her back to bed, Anne Marie was still in her bed. The second time she was not, and it was about 5:30 in the morning. Someone had a paper route that took them out really early at that point in time, and Anne Marie Burr was on his paper route. The front door was open, and of course there was a manhunt, but nobody found her. Now, there was construction going on around the area of where they lived, particularly road construction at that point in time. And Anne Marie Burr's father said he remembers seeing Ted Bundy in some of those construction sites on that morning. Construction would have been a perfect place for him to hide her if he actually did kill her, because nobody's going to dig, you know what I mean? If she's under the road or in a building, I'm pretty sure it was road work that was being done. If she was under the road at that point in time, guys, who's going to dig it up? I mean, unless they decide to dig up the road, but it would have been a perfect place for her to hide her, or for him to hide her. He was 14 at that point in time. Anne Rule believes that Anne Marie Burr was killed by him. So do a number of the detectives. And to be honest with you guys, I believe it myself. So could he have started killing when he was 14? That's a high possibility, but we don't know for sure. Her case has never been solved. And of course, her body has never been found. She was on his paper route, though, guys. Now, Ted Bundy himself has said, oh, you know, she was too far away, but she was on his paper route. And he also said there were some crimes that he legitimately would not talk about because they were too young. Anne Marie is too young, too close to home. She was close to his home, or too close to family. She would have been close to, she would have fit into all three characters, but regardless, he always denied killing her, and of course there were some crimes he wouldn't talk about. He also referenced that he had killed somebody in 1971 and 1973 respectively, and is considered a suspect in those particular murders. Sorry guys, we didn't talk about them in this video. Probably in the last one, we'll get into the people he's suspected of killing. At this point in time, we're just talking about the people he's known to have killed. He also is considered a suspect in murders from 1966 and murders from 1969. There was I think it was a single murder in 71, a single murder in 73, and in 71 and 70, when he was talking to the police, he was the one that said he had killed somebody in 1971 and that he had killed somebody in 1973. But these were girls whose names he either didn't get or didn't remember. He also was suspected of killing somebody in 1966, so he would have been about 20 then, and 2 women in 1969. And if you'll remember, 1969 was when he found out for sure about his illegitimacy. Did it provoke him to such an extent that he killed, right? Just like in 1973, that could have been the breakup. I know they broke up a lot, or 1971 and 73. 71, he would have still been seeing Stephanie. So I don't know for sure if something in one of their conversations, because he was still talking to her at that point in time, exacerbated it. So he felt the need to kill. Some killers do that. Like, they have a particular incident that will trigger them. So something must have triggered him at that point in time. Also, remember, he was still a little bit aimless at that point in time too. He was going to school. Sorry, I take that back. He wasn't aimless. I'm thinking about the earlier murders. So what do you guys think? What do you guys think? What triggered him? What made him start? When did he start? When do you guys think he started? Do you think he killed Anne Marie Burr? Do you think he was a psychopath? Or do you think he had something else going on? Let me know down below. I know we've talked a lot. I know we've gone through a lot for today. I'm sure this is going to be a longer one. I'm going to try to condense a little bit more. And unfortunately, I can't talk as much about the victims because there are so many. I'm trying to highlight, and I feel really terrible for not being able to do so. So please forgive me for that. I usually try to talk about the victims as much as I can, but Ted Bundy had so many. We would be here for forever if we did that. So I'm going to try to give you the most specific information I can on them. Let me know if there's anything I've forgotten, and hopefully I will see you guys back here next week. Hopefully you guys will like this video. Hopefully you'll subscribe if you haven't already done so. Have a good Father's Day if you're celebrating it, and I hope to see you guys next week for part 2. Bye for now, guys.